Hi there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the very first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel, I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of writing, and that's the characters. And the heart of the characters is their psychology. So that's what angle I like to take with pretty much everything I talk about on my channel. So today, I wanted to give you guys a little more insight into what I'm working on, but I wanted it to kind of relate to what I have been talking about, which for those of you who have been around has been different mental health diagnoses. And one of the things I like to do with world building is to incorporate as much of things that happen in our world as possible, but in a fantasy setting, because things like politics, illness, medicine, all those kinds of things, they all affect the world that you're creating. So for today, I wanted to talk to you guys about 5 mental health diagnoses in the world of my work in progress. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because mental health is a very important aspect of my work in progress. It is something that is brought up frequently, though not directly. I'm more of a subtle kind of person. But I do like to address things like abuse, trauma, all that kind of stuff, because it's important. So it occurred to me as I was writing this novel that it would make sense then that this world may not have the same mental disorders that we do. They may have very different ones. So that's where this came from. So I'm going to give you guys 5 of them. These may or may not pop up in the first book. They do pop up eventually in the planned series. It does not necessarily mean it will be a center focus point, but it will be there. So I just wanted to give you guys some little insight into that. Okay, so the very first illness I want to talk about is probably the one that is feared the most, and it can affect any species, but it primarily affects the Natu. It can affect either the Natuba, Natusa, or Natula. It doesn't matter. And that is an illness that they call emotional severance. And what this is it is a condition where the individual suddenly does not recognize anyone with whom they have a blood relation. So they will not recognize their parents. They will not recognize their siblings or anyone of that nature. However, they will recognize people with whom they have a strong emotional connection, but not a blood connection. But an emotional connection does not always mean a good emotional connection. So if they have someone that, let's say, they had a falling out with several years ago and it was a very prominent part of their life, they will recognize that person, but they will not necessarily recognize or remember what the event was, but they will know them. And this is a difficult disorder for people to cope with, because family for the most part is very important to Natu. So suddenly not being able to recognize your own family members is very distressing for them. And it's actually, though, one of the defensive factors for it is, like I said, the emotional connection to non-blood related people. And this is actually why they stress a strong friendship when children are young, is they encourage their children to go out and make friends and make strong connections with people that they can trust. And part of that is because of fear of this disorder, because you want someone that the person is able to recognize and trust if this disorder occurs. Is there treatment for it? Yes, there is treatment for it. But said treatment has to come from a blood relation. So if you no longer recognize your blood relation, you are not likely to go seek them out for treatment. So that's where the importance of the friend comes in, is they essentially become a mediator, convincing the person to get help and get it treated. It's treated through not to have an emotional extra sense. So whether they use it through smell, sight, sound, whatever, they have an extra spiritual sense that they can use to help treat this disorder. And essentially what it does is it reconnects these broken lines. It takes time. Usually the person will show improvement over, say, about a month, and then it gradually gets better and better. So it is considered curable. It usually takes about 2 to 3 years to do it entirely, though. So definitely a disorder that people have awareness of and respect for, and are obviously still doing research into. Second disorder is one that is only among the stonemen, and depending on who you ask, it has a different name. For sake of simplicity, I'm going to use locked-in syndrome is what they call it. Now, it is similar to what we have as locked-in syndrome, but it is slightly different. So locked-in syndrome is where essentially the soul begins to separate from the body, but it does not leave the body. So what this ends up doing is it results in a very catatonic state, and it's very gradual. So it starts with the individual kind of losing connection with their emotions. It starts with them losing connection with some bodily functions, like talking, eating, things like that. And it eventually ends with a person in almost a comatose-like state. But they are fully aware and fully awake. It's very, very rare. They still don't know quite what causes it. There is some speculation that it is caused by severe abuse, severe trauma, and that it is a protective mechanism. But because it's so rare, they're not sure. As a general rule, you're talking maybe 1 in 50,000 people get this disorder. So not very common at all. Is there treatment for it? Yeah, but it's an unsure treatment. It happens so rarely that when it does occur, they almost don't know what to do with it. The closest thing they have is getting people who have a strong connection to the person to try and use some form of magic to reach them on the spiritual level, to kind of almost encourage the soul back to the body. But again, it's so unknown and so rare that there really isn't effective treatment for it yet. But that doesn't mean people aren't trying. Right, the third disorder, this one affects mainly the dragrene. And it's one of those that you can ask a bunch of different people and you get a bunch of different names. The most prominent is what they call select stone syndrome. And what that means, it refers to actually refers to a game when the children are young, where you would attempt to replace stones with a stone that looked almost similar, and the goal of the game is to trick the person into not realizing that one has been replaced. So it's called that because essentially what happens is the individual develops this sense that they are no longer the person they thought they were. They think they are someone else entirely. Generally, it's someone that is well known, but not always. Sometimes it's a neighbor, sometimes it's a family member, and it's very sudden in its onset. Usually hits when the individual is approaching what they call sedna age, which is where they state their sexuality and they go into what we would call a mixture of high school and college. So they think it's something to do with when the body is going through that final physiological shift, but they're not entirely sure. This one is kind of unfortunate because there is treatment for it, and there is in fact essentially a cure for it. But it is very expensive, and it is only available to essentially people of higher class. So when this affliction hits the lower class, there's really not much they can do about it except attempt to make deals with the higher class nobility to try and get the treatment that their family member desperately needs. Sometimes this is successful, sometimes it is not, but most of the time what it ends up doing is it unfortunately essentially puts a family in servitude for usually about 2 or 3 generations. It's not fair, and it's messed up, and it's corrupt. But the whole drag queen culture is kind of corrupt. Their whole government's pretty corrupt. So that's actually a point I address in the story. So essentially this is one where it's not as distressing for the person going through it, it's more distressing for their family members. So there's that. The fourth one, this one is usually called, they call it history syndrome. And it affects pretty much anybody on the planet can get it. It seems to be more prominent among people that use magic. They're not entirely sure why, but it seems to be more prominent. And what this syndrome is basically the person suddenly has access to memories of people who have long since passed on. So they might have memories of like their first governor, or they might have memories of their great-great-grandmother. And the problem is they get so many memories that they can't sort out their own memories, and so it's very overwhelming. And because they have so many to sort through, they have a really hard time processing the present moment, so they lose sense of time. They lose a sense of where they are presently. And a lot of the time, this is an illness that is usually noticeable pretty quickly, because it's one of those illnesses where the person is aware, okay, something weird is going on here. This isn't my memory. These aren't my memories. And so they can go and beseech people for help. This is one of those where you almost have to cure it with magic. They're not sure what causes it, but they know that using magic can fix it, or at least keep it at bay. This is one of those that really doesn't have a cure, but it can be treated. So it's very rare. I think of all these diseases, both physical and mental, this is probably the most rare. And in some cases, people believe that if a person has this affliction, it's because they were chosen by whatever higher power they happen to believe in to have these memories. And so the idea is not to get rid of them, but to slow their onslaught so that the person can still live their life and process. So what usually ends up happening is they will give the person a trinket, a magical trinket. It's usually about yay big. It's not that big. And they will actually wear it either in a headband or on a necklace or something. And what it does, it's essentially a filter. And what it does is it's a spell that keeps the memories from hitting all at once. So if they were getting onslaughts of, like, let's say 40 memories from 40 different people, this will slow it to it so it's 2 or 3 people, so that they're able to process through it and move on with their life. Some people strive for a cure for it, some people do not. Some people, they consider it to be a calling for whatever their career is. So if they're suddenly getting memories of, say, historians, they might believe it's their job to be a historian. If they're suddenly getting memories of people who were highly involved in government, they might consider that a call to go into politics, that kind of thing. So it definitely varies from person to person to person, but is probably the most rare on this list. All right, the last one. This one is only has only shown up among the Natula up in the north, and they think it might be related to the environment. So that's one theory, but not proven yet. And this one is called temperate syndrome. And essentially what it is the person essentially acquires essentially an affliction where their sense of temperature is now gone. They no longer can regulate what's cold, what's warm. So some people consider it a physical affliction, but nothing physically is wrong. So it's all in the mind. So it's a delusional type of disorder. And while this isn't considered necessarily as dangerous, because usually the Natula live in families, so most of the time if someone has developed this affliction, they're just going to rely on their family to say, okay, it's cold outside, I need to wear my furs, or the thaw has come, so I don't have to wear as much stuff. But it does become a problem if the person is on their own and they have no one there to kind of help them realize what the temperature is. So that's really what makes it dangerous, is if the person has no support. They think it might be kind of a poisoning kind of thing. Like there's some theory that that there is a residue from the sirens in the water that causes a change in the brain, but they don't know. Doesn't seem to have a specific age that it occurs at, doesn't seem to have a specific gender or specific physical trait that it's attracted to. It just seems to hit at random. A member of the nobility family does live with it, and they have learned kind of physical ways to tell temperature, and that's how they get along, as well as obviously having lots of support. But this is probably one of those that it's dangerous if you live on your own, but most people in the Natula region do not live on their own. So that's that one. And those are the main 5 that you guys will see pop up. And again, I put these in here because I think it's important to incorporate things like mental struggles and things like that into your world, because I think it makes it feel more real. Like I said, I don't think any of these are going to be center point, but they will be there and they will be important. And I like to explore what cultures do with different challenges, and this is one of those challenges. So thank you guys for chiming in for my video. I hope you found it interesting. As always, if you have comments or suggestions, be sure to leave them below. I will get to them as soon as I can. And if you want to make sure you don't miss when I upload, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you'll be notified whenever a new video goes up. I try to upload every Friday, every Sunday. And until next time, I hope you guys have a good one.